Autopilot and the Elephant. This was how it started. I arrived at a supermarket one day and suddenly realized I could not remember the major part of the car journey. Autopilot, some people call it. You know that curious metaphor, the elephant in the room? I looked it up in Wikipedia about a month ago after my initial data discovery. Here is its origin. In 1814, Ivan Krylov, 1769 to 1844, poet and fabulist, wrote a fable entitled The Inquisitive Man, which tells of a man who goes to a museum and notices all sorts of tiny things, but fails to notice an elephant. Not actually seeing the obvious was its original meaning, rather than today's usage, avoiding the obvious. I also pondered on the condition of not being aware of something in which one is physically engaged. To take extremes, at the grisly end are les tricoteuses, those women who did not pause knitting as they watched heads roll from the blades of the guillotine. At the benign end is my mother, who knitted while she watched television. One day I heard a cackle from her in the bathroom. She had just emptied a bowl of sugar into the toilet instead of leaves from the teapot. She didn't remember picking up the bowl and carrying it to the bathroom. We can all recall something similar, like whether or not we've brushed our teeth or have we taken that tablet? Well, let me introduce myself. I'm a contract data engineer. To be more exact, I am a consultant data correlator. My company is phenomenally well paid by governments and corporates to create algorithms that find patterns in social media data. Terrorists planning, activism, parenting behaviours, social attitudes. My name is Alvin Mortensen and I'm 35 years old. In my spare time, I take these same skills and apply them to reports of inexplicable events to feed my website, theunexplained.net. There are thousands of groups who discuss their otherworldly experiences online, from alien abduction to, as in this case, the everyday experience of lost time. I gather data and create intensity graphs and maps showing locations where specific activities are greatest. These I post, stark, unadorned, unanalyzed, on my website. I have several million credulous followers. It's like throwing red meat to wolves. Anyway, I mentioned lost time. As you can see, I'm using the term to cover those lacunae in our lives, from milliseconds to hours, for which we cannot account. Where we're the absentee landlords of our earthly pursuits. My experience of lost time on the way to the supermarket was rare. Yet, when I returned home and dipped into social media, I discovered it was very common. It led me to suppose that there could be something inexplicable hidden in the data. An elephant? About a week later, I downloaded a UK graph. It was unremarkable, except for one unusual spike. Experience of lost time while driving was evenly distributed across the UK, except, bizarrely, for an aggregation of reports regarding a remote stretch of minor road in Storm Fell in the Lake District. There were a couple of dozen accounts of lost time on this road during the last 2 years. This is a very high percentage of incidents considering the sparsity of traffic. But what piqued my curiosity even more was that all the accounts were from strangers to that area, so I could eliminate the autopilot theory. These drivers would have been acutely aware of the road and the environment, given they'd never been there before. All of them had to pass significant landmarks. a small lake on one side, and an enormous standing stone on the other. In 5 cases where cars contained passengers, they were also oblivious of these landmarks. In 2 of these 5 cases, the cars had taken that road precisely to visit the stone and had to drive back to do so. My hobby had already caused a furore with the authorities when I published a map containing a weird anomaly of missing persons in a London borough. Angry police, council complaints, class actions by residents, suddenly aware that their missing loved ones were part of an unexplained horror pattern. I didn't want to deluge the storm-fell area in amateur ufologists carrying cameras and gauges of every kind, but it was sufficiently appealing an anomaly for me to pay a visit. You see, what I've always hoped for is the miraculous uncovering of an otherworldly phenomenon in everyday life, which no one has registered before. The aforesaid elephant. A month or 2 later, I arranged a couple of days' absence from work. I booked a bed in a village pub called the Devil's Finger close by. I carried the usual gear, car cam, photo lens and video camera, radiation monitor, heat sensor, sound recorder, etc., etc. I could capture anything from a single particle of alien dust to a blanket mist of ectoplasm. I reached the vicinity of the by-road in late afternoon. The sun was low and created long, waving shadows as it silhouetted trees tossing in the wind. I parked and set up instrumentation before driving slowly along the 2 miles. There was no other traffic to be irritated by my speed. I noted the little tarn of black water on one side and the tall, thin, almost reproving standing stone on the other. Then I checked in at the pub for 2 nights. Everyone was jolly. I presented myself as a tourist who liked to be off the beaten track. The stone seemed interesting. Were there any myths associated with it? Well, it was known as the Giant's Finger, hence the name of the pub. Tourists often had a deal of trouble finding it. So, locally, it had become nicknamed the Missing Finger. Even locals got absent-minded sometimes and failed to see it on passing. I spent a few minutes before sleep in my room examining the data from my instrumentation. There was nothing untoward. I also had to accept the fact that my hypothesis that only visitors went mental walkabout on the road no longer held water. It could be an autopilot experience after all. Now that would be disappointing. But then again, local victims of blindness were unlikely to be the types to add their experiences to groups of paranormalists on the internet. After a rather meat-heavy breakfast, I drove along the aforesaid stretch of road, not a hint of anything unusual. I repeated the journey several times. Each time I actually seemed more rather than less aware of the rugged landscape, the water, and the stone. I returned for a pub lunch. I was the only customer. Irene, the landlady, was in expansive mood. At one point I said, "Funny all this stuff about tourists and the missing finger." She leant forward, elbows on the bar, and said, "It goes way back before cars. They say that cattle drovers from over the ridge down south, bringing herds up for summer feed, arrived here often puzzled that they hadn't seen it on their way. In those days it was called the walking stone." "I must put all this in my book," I said, teasingly. "Whoa, a book? That'll help put us on the map. Good. Book? Hey, you ought to talk to Bobby Amble. He's a retired school teacher. What he doesn't know about the Devil's Finger is not worth knowing. I'll phone him now if you like." She beamed at my grateful nod and went off to do it. In short, 2 hours later, Bobby Amble and I were parked by the stone. He was a tubby fellow in long khaki shorts, in his 70s with wispy white hair and a dark tanned face. He was a fell walker. He pointed out when we met that I looked like I needed a few months in the wilds to get rid of my prison pallor. The stone reared above us some 9 metres. There were another 4 or 5 metres under the surface. He'd told me on the way that it had been moved some 50 miles from a Neolithic quarry to the north. An ancient miracle. I've had it tested. Among some quite rare elements, it's got a very high iron content, enough to hold a magnet, and it's often hit by lightning. See those scorch marks? I nodded. It's a lovely reminder of our ancestors. Then he said, after a pause, "No missing persons here, like you found in London, though, I'm afraid." He saw my surprise. "I looked you up when Irene phoned. You're an internet celebrity." "All I do is present inexplicable data." "I'm all for it," he laughed. "The authorities try to cover up everything that contradicts political orthodoxy, and science has a closed mind too often. Regard me as a fellow traveller. Always was a marginal character myself." I then confessed my full reason for being there, but added that it was for personal, not public interest. He thought for a while. "I've lived here 30 years and thought it was just a local thing, the missing finger. But your data does suggest otherwise." He thought for a moment. "What we need to know is what drivers are experiencing when they aren't seeing, so to speak." "Good thinking," said I, wondering why it hadn't occurred to me. Bobby continued, "I'll do some interviewing around here while you do your web follow-up." He added animatedly, "Then we can correlate." We talked for a while about ley lines, stone monoliths and circle myths. A man after my own heart. After a further night in the pub, I drove home to Oxford. I circulated a questionnaire to the couple of dozen whose posts I'd uncovered across the internet groups. I was careful to make them think they were part of a much larger population so as not to highlight that there was something special about the road passing the giant's finger. I set up an AI program to correlate and convert the sound and text reports into video footage. Bobby sent me interview recordings every few days, but we refrained from speculation until all the data was in. What was immediately apparent to me was that all the drivers had very little memory of the events. But each of them recalled something odd or something it was difficult to put a word to in their general sea of forgetfulness. Like bubbles, ropes, a lighthouse, a weird sense of dreamy joy. In isolation, these fragments meant little to those recalling them. But when all the fragments were integrated into a whole, what picture would my AI create? Feeling very righteous that I had not viewed the AI video before we shared screens, with a gulp, I switched it on. The 40 or so fragmented, apparently insignificant witness reports had been converted by the AI program into a coherent video 1 minute and 23 seconds long. It showed the following. We're in the driving seat of a vehicle, gazing along a road through the windscreen. A fine, almost translucent curtain hangs across our path. We pass through it. We enter a brighter world. The sun is at its zenith, and its rays reflect off what appear to be enormous hovering spheres anchored at different heights to the ground. The skies are full of the movement of silent, disc-like craft jetting purposefully in all directions. At the heart of this busy alien settlement stands the giant's finger, that tall column of natural rock. Millisecond pulses of lightning crackle between it, the flying craft, and the anchored spheres. Then we pass through a second curtain into normality, and we resume the road which winds its way into Storm Fell. Bobby and I sat, staring at each other, unable to speak. So there we are. I hope you enjoyed Autopilot and the Elephant. If you did, and you haven't read it yet, The Light at the End is another road story on this channel. I suppose one of the arts of storytelling is to find ways to make the mundane exotic. That, together with a twist ending, supplies the adrenaline for the reader. I hope so anyway. Please subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, and share links with friends. In the meantime, if you want to read my work, you can go to www.jacksanger.com, and there are free downloads there of novels, plays, short stories and poetry. In the meantime, I'll be back soon with another little tale. Go in peace. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.